Welcome back to the Lane Ferris Show. As 9/11 is now legal to drink, I figured I'd go ahead and honor the traumatic event I probably witnessed when I was 3 weeks old by talking about the president that led during that time, George W. Bush. Now for starters, Ronald Reagan was president from 1981 to 1989, and his vice president George H.W. Bush ruled from 1989 to 1993. After losing re-election after his first term because the crowd thought he meant there will be no new taxes, when he really meant you should know there will be new taxes, Bill Clinton presided from 1993 to 2001 before his son, George W. Bush, ruled from 2001 to 2009. Now, my overall claim in this evaluation is that I think the 43rd president's legacy is often remembered for 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis, which also traumatized my 7-year-old self, little did I know. But I think it should be noted that he indeed had a hard set of problems put into his lap. During his presidency, he had to deal with 9/11, the consequential Afghanistan war, even though yes, this was his fault, you can add the Iraq war as well, the AIDS epidemic, Hurricane Katrina, the housing crisis, the Great Recession, and others. He is considered by many to be one of the worst presidents we've had, but I have to question the reasons for that. The most common criticisms against him are 9/11 happening under his watch, dragging the Afghanistan war, No Child Left Behind, the Patriot Act, the Iraq War, which I will most certainly get to later, Katrina, and the Great Recession. But notice how most of these gripes originate from areas that are out of his control. 4 of the things I listed were related to 9/11. No Child Left Behind was an overwhelming bipartisan effort. Katrina was a natural disaster, and the president has rather limited control over the economy. Now, sure, you can still look into these issues scrupulously and argue that he still could have handled them better, and that is a completely fair point. But at the same time, outside of these, there is not very much remembered about the W. Bush presidency. If we are to evaluate his job on the basis of his handlings of these inevitable problems, I would assert that the only way you can really judge him is by comparing him to the alternative scenarios in the case someone else took his place, which of course is very hard to measure because that is something we can only speculate. Herbert Hoover is remembered as a very bad president, though a common consensus is that he was qualified in other things, but he was not prepared for the Great Depression. Would he have been a better president had this crisis out of his control not occur and he ruled with his other better developed abilities? That seems pretty unfair. Imagine if World War II never happened, which its pursuit made up a big chunk of Franklin D. Roosevelt's legacy, and he was remembered significantly less fondly. Hell, Bush's approval rating actually skyrocketed beyond 90% after 9/11 due to the nation's emotional desperation for a strong leader. I know this is unrealistic, but had the American people been more rational during that period, they would have judged him in reference to how they would have inferred other presidents would lead given his shoes. Now, of course, that never would have happened. But so long after the fact, we can not only properly evaluate him as someone who inherited many problems rather than created them, but also even note that he did not briefly become a godly president just because he led the country through it, which was essentially his job. So I've made my point clear. Let's now dive into this time and apply it. Right off the bat, his election drew controversy because Bill Clinton's vice president Al Gore won the popular vote. One factor behind his loss was this ballot design. If I'm being honest, this really isn't confusing. The arrows clearly direct you to the spot you vote for a candidate. I dare say this was natural selection. Pat Buchanan got about 3,000 more votes than he expected, but Florida was a very close race and Gore wanted a recount. However, his request was mainly in Democratic areas, and to be honest, I don't entirely blame them for the refusal given its nature. There are also studies suggesting he would have won had Florida made a full recount. Ultimately, Bush won by 7 out of 9 Supreme Justices and was thus elected president. So, not even 8 months into his term, the September 11th attacks occurred. We all know about this, and pretty much any argument that it was an inside job can be addressed online. Now, some assert that this happened under Bush's watch, and therefore he bears responsibility for it. Sure, he does, but just as much as anyone else in the position for government. He could have taken threats on the country more seriously, but here's the thing. The country received many threats all the time. You don't realize how hard it is to distinguish bogus threats from legitimate ones, and the agencies that provided these threats were the same people that were put in charge of stopping it in the first place. That, and the details of the threats were minimal, not giving them a very good idea on how to act. However, one could definitely argue that his measures helped avoid another terrorist attack happening on American soil. As awful as its execution was, the Patriot Act did at least undermine attempts on airlines. He created the Homeland Security Act, which took the threat more seriously and modded the CIA to improve intelligence on attacks. As a result, 2 potential 9/11s were avoided with the US Bank Tower and the Sears Tower. By all means, he took the nation's protection seriously when the world was shaken from the post-Cold War sense of invincibility. Counterterrorism measures involve these, and of course his following wars, the first of which I will address now. I do not think Afghanistan was his war. In hindsight, was it a mistake? Perhaps an execution. But Al-Qaeda was severely weakened and Afghanistan was already unstable as it was. It's understandable why America would have gone, even if it was for imperialism, as I can't think of any reason not to from a moral standpoint. Afghanistan was harboring bin Laden, and told America that they would give him up if they could provide irrefutable proof he was guilty. There was shaky evidence that bin Laden was behind the attacks, but given he led Al-Qaeda and there were connections with the group and how Afghanistan proved itself untrustworthy, they decided to dive in right away. Now, of course, I don't agree with the length it fought there, but the reason Bush didn't take troops out is the same reason neither Barack Obama nor Donald Trump did, because they faced struggle in defeating the jihadist nature of the country. Overall, could he have handled it better? Sure, as he could have handled 9/11 better, but these alone don't necessarily overtake his standing. Moving on to his second term comes the matter of Hurricane Katrina. When I first heard of this issue, I was rather skeptical as Hurricane Harvey flooded southern America and the media was surprisingly quiet on Trump about it, which is genuinely shocking. After doing my research, I would learn that while the federal government failed to act on it, the state and local levels were absolutely critical in its failure. Part of the criticism was that Bush appointed an insufficient director, Michael D. Brown, in charge of FEMA, but I'm not exactly sure how he would have figured the consequences of that decision. Overall, it was a failure with everyone involved, but it isn't as if he did nothing about it, given he supposedly pleaded with the mayor to call a state of emergency. Then came, of course, the Great Recession. There were indeed many people to blame for this, including the greedy bankers, American consumers, and even Bill Clinton admitted to contributing to the housing market crisis by rewriting the Community Reinvestment Act. This certainly would have happened with or without Bush, and he actually warned of issues in places like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac causing economic troubles as early as 2001, but his requests weren't taken seriously. Overall, with these main criticisms, I think the sum of his evaluation is that he could have handled them better, but he was certainly granted a lot more disasters than average. I think some of the good things were overlooked, as after 9/11 he actually made sure to clarify to the Americans that they were targeting Muslim extremists as opposed to the whole religion of Islam. Okay, now let's get to the elephant in the room.